So welcome everyone to today's Knowledge Capital webinar. Today we're focusing on approaches to Indigenous History Month and National Indigenous Peoples Day, which is June 21st. My name is Kelly Lindsay, President and CEO of Indigenous Works, and great to welcome our employer partners, which are our members and members of the public to this today's Knowledge Capital webinar. You know, as you think about this topic, approaches to Indigenous History Month and National Indigenous Day, I want you to think about who are people that you know that have contributed historically to Canada's contributions. And then you can put it in the contemporary sense in terms of how has history been shaped and is being shaped today by leaders. And if you look historically, I mean, we know that there's been tremendous contributions by Indigenous people. And what I like about this approach is instead of looking at things through the deficit agenda all the time, we start to look at it through the positive or positive attributes and the assets and the contributions that Indigenous people, communities, and worldviews have brought to Canada and indeed around the world. So today what we're going to do is Mandy Price is going to take you through a deeper insight into Indigenous history, which is important as we celebrate History Month, and then more about who are some of these folks that have made a great contribution and how you might be looking at these in your own workplaces in terms of how you look at celebrating Indigenous History Month and National Indigenous Peoples Day, how you can position your company. And towards the end, we'll talk more about some strategies, and Nicole and I will come in with Mandy on some more strategic considerations on how you can align these events with your overall positioning, attraction, recruitment strategies. So with that, pleased to hand it over to Mandy Price for today's webinar. Mandy, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Some of you may have heard me speak previously. My name is Mandy Price. I'm an Indigenous Works Associate for Training and Consulting. I am a member of the Red Rock Indian Band. I'm an Anishinaabe Kwe, Ojibwe on my mother's side, Cree on my father's side. I am a first-generation day school and residential school survivor in my family. And I am currently a PhD candidate through Texas Tech in the Business and Management Leadership Program. With that, I would like to honor my traditional territory. As mentioned, I am a member of the Red Rock Indian Band, who are signatories of the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. I acknowledge Canada as the land of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I recognize this land that is shared through historic treaties, developed through contemporary treaties, and land that continues to be unceded territory today. As mentioned, I am currently working on my PhD, so this afternoon I am speaking to you from the land of the Choctaw Nation, found on the southeastern Oklahoma, northeast Texas border. About Indigenous Works, we came out of a recommendation in the 1996 report on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. Our mandate is to increase Indigenous engagement in the Canadian economy. We are an award-winning, ISO-certified national Indigenous organization with expertise in workplace, employment, corporate Indigenous engagement, and partnership systems. In 2015, we launched the Cochita Charity, the mandate to increasing human resource and career potential of Indigenous youth, including youth with disabilities. We also have our Luminary project with the sole purpose of advancing Indigenous innovation. Our leadership objectives for today, we're going to go through an overview of Indigenous history in Canada, as well as Indigenous contributions to Canadian society and strategies for employers to support their workforce. Let's begin with the Indigenous history in Canada. Our originations. This map is the most comprehensive ever created for Indigenous groups of Canada before colonization and contact with Europeans. This map represents nations that survived incursions as well as those that did not. The map utilizes the original and true tribal names for each nation in addition to their original locations. This map has been graciously provided by a creator, Aaron Carapella, my friend, who is a Cherokee living in Oklahoma. The early First Nations. We had 6 groups. the woodland First Nations who lived in dense boreal forests in the eastern part of the country. The Iroquois First Nations who inhabited the southernmost area, a fertile land that is suitable for planting corn, beans, and squash. The Plains First Nations who lived in the grasslands of the prairies. The Plateau First Nations whose geography ranged from semi-desert conditions in the south to high mountains and dense forest in the north. The Pacific Coast First Nations, who had access to abundant salmon and shellfish, and the gigantic red cedar for building large homes. And the First Nations of the Mackenzie and Yukon River basins, whose harsh environment consisted of dark forests, barren lands, and swampy terrain known as muskeg. First contact to 1762. Before European explorers first set foot on the eastern borders of the continent in the 11th century, Indigenous peoples had lived in North America for tens of thousands of years. These newcomers were Norse explorers and colonists who came from Scandinavia and moved steadily westward through Iceland and Greenland before arriving on the island of Newfoundland. At L'Anse aux Meadows, they established the first European settlement in North America. Although this colony was brief, it signaled the start of European discovery and migration that would profoundly alter the lives of the Indigenous peoples of North America. European settlers made a comeback to North America's eastern shores in the 1500s to construct settlements. Many Europeans by then had heard from returning fishermen about the abundance of resources the New World had to offer. The Basque, Breton, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Irish, and English fishermen had already contacted and traded with the Mi'kmaq people, Maliseet, and the Passamaquoddy peoples of the eastern seaboard, drawn by the Grand Banks booming cod stocks. These fishermen established an unofficial commerce system with First Nations by trading European goods for furs as they returned each summer to fish and dry cure their haul. As the various European nations fought to increase their own wealth and influence in this new world, a network of rival colonies soon developed throughout the Americas. The British and the French rose to dominance in North America quickly. The British had already established a number of colonies and had started widespread colonization by the early 1600s. Acadia in the Maritimes and New France in the St. Lawrence Valley served as the foundation of France's North American empire. The two powers forged agreements with First Nations soon after establishing these colonies in order to advance their business goals, which included the fur trade. The Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, then the Seneca First Nations, along with First Nations of the Allegheny Mountain region, comprised the Iroquois Confederacy, presently known as the Haudenosaunee, or people of the Longhouse. The Huron, Algonquin, Odawa, and Montagnais, as well as the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy, were among the First Nations associated with the French north of the St. Lawrence River. The English and French, along with their First Nation allies, formed a massive trade centered on beaver pelts that extended throughout North America by utilizing the well-established Indigenous trade routes of the interior. The results of this trade was increased European exploration throughout the Great Lakes Basin, into the prairies, and down the Mississippi River. The fur trade was so profitable and important that the various European and First Nations interests often clashed violently throughout the 16th and 17th century. In 1701, this tumultuous era came to an end when France and 40 First Nations signed a treaty in Montreal known as the Great Peace. As French and British colonies moved further inland, the struggle for control of North America's rich interior emerged as a new front in the wars raging across Europe. The British and the French in particular engaged in powerful conflicts that converted their different business relationships with First Nations into crucial military alliances that provided both sides of the conflict with much needed support. Desperate for military assistance ahead of what would turn out to be the initial French-British conflict in North America, known as the 7 Years' War, British administrators created the Indian Department in 1755. to coordinate alliances with the powerful Haudenosaunee peoples. The fall of Montreal in 1760 signaled the end of French colonial activities in what would later become Canada. The First Nations alliances, which had been established for more than 150 years, were realigned as a result of the British triumph. The British signed a number of treaties in the former provinces of New France and Acadia to guarantee the neutrality of First Nations and to forge peaceful connections. Numerous peace and friendship treaties were signed between the British, the Mi'kmaq, the Maliseet, and the Passamaquoddy peoples in the Maritime region, where land disputes had been fierce since the early 1700s. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 was the founding constitutional document for Canada. It was signed on October 7, 1763 by King George III. 50% of the issues within the Royal Proclamation dealt with First Nations issues. It discussed First Nations and Crown relations, as well as First Nations inheritance rights, and set out the foundation for future treaty-making processes found in Canada. The development of the Indian Act. It was created in 1876 as a means to facilitate assimilation, setting regulations and restricting the rights of First Nations peoples and communities, authorizing the Canadian federal government to regulate and administer the affairs and day-to-day lives of registered Indians and reserve communities. It imposed structures like bound councils and reserved lands, and restricted or made illegal traditional forms of governments, such as our hereditary chiefs, our ceremonies, including Sundance and Potlatch, and the gathering of 3 or more Indigenous people at one time, as well as Indigenous people's ability to access the court or lawyers. While the Indian Act has been revised over the years, it continues to exist and govern us to this day. Civilizing the Indian. Active in Canada from the 1830s to the 1990s, Canada's history is this. Residential schools were an intentional effort by the government to assimilate Indigenous children who were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to live at these schools. These children were punished for expressing one's Indigenous culture or language. Malnourishment, sexual and physical abuse, torture, lack of medical care and neglect were common practice at these schools. Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the head of Department of Indian Affairs 26 years, sole mandate was to take the Indian out of the child. There were approximately 130 residential schools, with 150,000 children being forced to attend these schools. They were the only schools with graveyards and many with barbed wire fences. Our communities were left without children. Social family dynamics were destroyed and forever changed. The devastating scars of residential schools leave lingering effects, such as the loss of culture, loss of language, and loss of identity. The residential school timeline. In 1831, the Mohawk Indian Residential School first opened in Brantford, Ontario. It was created in 1876. The Indian Act was created as a means, again, to facilitate assimilation and setting the regulations and restricting the rights of First Nations people and communities, and authorizing the Canadian federal government to regulate the affairs and day-to-day lives of registered Indian and reserve communities. 1883, Sir John A. Macdonald authorized the creation of the residential schools in the Canadian West. And in order to educate children properly, we must separate them from their families. Some people may say this is hard, but if we want to civilize them, then this is what we must do. 1885, the Indian Act was first amended. This is where it started to impose our structures, such as bound councils and reserve land, and restricted or made illegal the traditional forms of governments, our ceremonies, and the gathering of 3 or more people. In 1907, the first whistleblower, medical inspector for the Department of Indian Affairs, Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, reports that the health conditions in residential schools are a national crime. In 1920, Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the deputy superintendent of Indian Affairs at the time, makes residential school attendance compulsory for children between the ages of 7 and 15. 1951, we saw major revisions to the Indian Act. Women were now allowed to participate in van democracy, and prohibitions on traditional Aboriginal practices and ceremonies were removed. 1958, the Indian Affairs Regional Inspectors recommend the abolition of the residential schools. 1961, yet another revision to the Indian Act. The amendment to the Indian Act included status Indians can now vote without having to give up their status rights in federal elections. In 1982, the Constitution Act is amended and includes the Indian Act and now recognizes and affirms the rights of Indian, Inuit, and Métis peoples of Canada. From 1986 to 1994, the United Church, the Catholic Missionaries of Mary Immaculate, the Anglican Church, and the Presbyterian Church all issue formal apologies for their participation in the residential school system. 1991 to 1996, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, RCAP, was a Canadian Royal Commission established in 1991 with the aim of investigating the relationship between Indigenous peoples in Canada, the Government of Canada, and Canadian society as a whole. The final report on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples was released in 1996. It called for a public inquiry into the effects of residential schools on the generations of Aboriginal peoples. 1996 to 1998, we saw the first class action lawsuits launched by residential school survivors. 2005, Assembly of First Nations National Chief Phil Fontaine announces a class action lawsuit against the Government of Canada over the legacy of the residential schools. 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologized to the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples for the residential school system in the House of Commons. 2009, as part of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, IRSSA, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, is launched and hosts events all across the country to listen to Aboriginal Canadians who want to share their residential school stories. The Truth and Reconciliation Commissioners, as we can see from the slide, from left to right, were Chief Justice Murray Sinclair, Chief Willie Littlechild, and Dr. Marie Wilson. 2013, the signing ceremony officially recognizing the University of Manitoba and its partners as the permanent host of the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. 2014, the final national TRC event was held in Edmonton, Alberta. 2015, the closing ceremonies for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, their final report, and their 94 specific calls to action were released. 1960s to the 1980s. 1960, John Beaconbaker brings the first Indigenous senator, Gladstone, in 1958. 2 years later, 1960, the First Nations get the right to vote in Canadian elections. 1973, the Calder Supreme Court decision was a decision by the Supreme Court of Canada. It was the first time that Canadian law acknowledged the Aboriginal title to land existed prior to the colonization of the continent and was not merely derived from statutory law. In 1982, the Canadian Constitution Act was introduced as part of Canada's process of patriating the Constitution, introducing several amendments to the British North America Act of 1867, including renaming it to the Constitution Act. In addition to patriating the Constitution, it enacted the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, guaranteed the rights of Aboriginal peoples of Canada, and provided for future constitutional conferences and set out the procedures for amending the Constitution in the future. In the 1990s to 2014, as mentioned, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples was released in 1990, and well as the report released in 1996. 1998, we saw the Haida Modern Treaty created, as well as 1999. Nunavut was created from the separation of the Northwest Territories. 2001, this is where we saw Prime Minister Stephen Harper's apology in the House of Commons for the residential school system. 2010, the Vancouver Olympics had 4 host First Nations, the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Lil'wat First Nations. As well as 2014, the Chilcotin decision on the existence of Indigenous title was affirmed by the Supreme Court of Canada. In 2015 to today. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report and the 94 specific calls to action were released. 2021, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act received royal assent. In 2022, we found Pope Francis' apology in Canada for the Catholic Church's role in the residential school system. Who we are today. Indigenous peoples are the fastest growing population in Canada, with a population that grew by 42.5% between 2000 and 2021. Indigenous peoples are the youngest population in Canada. About 44% were under the age of 25 in 2016, compared to 28% of the non-Indigenous population. Métis. The term Métis is used to describe communities of mixed European and Indigenous descent across Western Canada and is defined by the Métis Nation of Canada as a specific community of people which comprises of distinct Métis communities developed along the routes of the fur trade and across the Northwest within the Métis Nation homeland. This homeland includes 3 prairie provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, as well as parts of Ontario, British Columbia, and the Northwest Territories, and the Northern United States. The Métis represent about 32% of the Indigenous population. Inuit are the Indigenous people of the Arctic. The word Inuit means the people in the Inuit language of Inuktitut. Inuit comprise 4% of the total Indigenous population, with approximately 64,000 individuals identifying as Inuit in the 2021 census. There are approximately 1 million registered Indians in Canada and comprising 49% of the Indigenous population. There are 634 First Nation communities in Canada, which represent more than 50 nations and 50 Indigenous languages. According to the 2021 Census of Canada, about 40% of registered Indians live on reserve, 14% live in rural areas off reserve, and 45% live in urban areas. 70% of First Nations reserve communities have less than 500 inhabitants, while only 4% have more than 2,000 inhabitants. Non-status Indians live almost exclusively off reserve, and non-status Indians account for 14% of the Indigenous population, and about 76% live in urban areas. Indigenous contributions. Tecumseh and the War of 1812. Tecumseh was born in the Shawnee Territory in what is now Xenia, Ohio, between 1764 and 1771. The best evidence suggests a birth date of around March 1768. Like most Shawnees, his name indicated his clan, and translations of his name from the Shawnee language include I crossed the way and shooting star, with references to a meteor associated with the Panther clan. In June 1812, Tecumseh arrived at Fort Malden in Amherstburg to join his cause with the British in the War of 1812. The British had few troops and scant resources in the West, so Native allies were essential to the defense of Upper Canada. The British quickly recognized Tecumseh as the most influential of their Indian allies and relied upon him to direct the Native forces. He and his warriors scouted and probed enemy positions as the American General William Hull crossed into Canada and threatened to take Fort Malden. On July 25th, Tecumseh's warriors skirmished with Americans north of Amherstburg, inflicting the first American fatalities of the war. Tecumseh turned his attention to cutting off Hull's supply and communication lines on the U.S. side of the border, south of Detroit. On August 5th, he led 25 warriors in 2 successive ambushes, scattering a far superior force. Tecumseh captured Hull's outgoing mail, which revealed that the general was fearful of being cut off. On August 9th, Tecumseh joined the British soldiers at the Battle of Magua, successfully thwarting Hull's attempts to reopen his line of communication. 2 days later, Hull pulled the last of his men from Amherstburg, ending Canada. Tecumseh led about 530 warriors in the siege of Detroit. According to one account, Tecumseh had his men repeatedly pass through an opening in the woods to create the impression that thousands of Native Americans were outside the fort. To almost everyone's astonishment, Hull decided to surrender on August 16th. Tecumseh returned to Amherstburg in 1813. Meanwhile, the Americans, having suffered defeat at the Battle of Frenchtown in January 1813, Tecumseh and Roundhead led about 1,200 warriors to Fort Meigs, recently constructed American fort along the Maumee River in Ohio. Tecumseh and Proctor returned to the Fort Meigs in July 1813. Tecumseh, with approximately 2,500 warriors, the largest force that he would ever lead. They had little hope of taking the strongly defended fort, but Tecumseh sought to draw the Americans into open battle. He staged a mock battle within earshot of the fort, hoping the Americans would ride out to assist. The ruse unfortunately failed, and the second siege of Fort Meigs was lifted. Proctor then led a detachment to attack Fort Stephenson on the Sandusky River, while Tecumseh went west to intercept potential American advances. Proctor's attack failed, and the expedition returned to Amherstburg. Tecumseh hoped further offenses were forthcoming, but after the American naval victory in the Battle of Lake Erie on September 10, 1813, Proctor decided to retreat from Amherstburg. Tecumseh pleaded with Proctor to stay and fight, stating, "Our lives are in the hands of the Great Spirit. We are determined to defend our lands, and if it is his will, we will wish to leave our bones upon them." Proctor insisted the offense of Amherstburg was untenable, now that the Americans controlled Lake Erie, but he promised to make a stand at Chatham along the Thames River. Tecumseh reluctantly agreed. The British burned Fort Malden and public buildings in Amherstburg, then began to retreat, with William Henry Harrison's army in pursuit. Tecumseh arrived at Chatham to find that Proctor had retreated even further upriver. Proctor sent word that he had chosen to make a stand near Moravian Town. Tecumseh was angered by the change in plans, but he led a rear guard action at Chatham to slow the American defenses and was slightly wounded in the arm. Many of Tecumseh's despairing allies deserted during the retreat, leaving him with only 500 warriors. Proctor and Tecumseh, outnumbered more than 3-1, faced the Americans at the Battle of the Thames on October 5th. Tecumseh positioned his men in a line of trees along the right, hoping to flank the Americans. The left, commanded by Proctor, collapsed almost immediately, and Proctor fled the battlefield. Colonel Richard Mentor Johnson led the American charge against the Indians. Tecumseh was killed in the fierce fighting, and the Indians dispersed. The Americans had won a decisive victory. Contemporary contributions to Canadian society. Stephen Keeshub became the first UA Local 67 member to move to an international competition. He was the first UA Regional Apprenticeship Competition member in welding, as well as Canada's first in Canada's US national competition. Sergeant Tommy Prince is a member of Broken Hand Band in Minnesota. He was the first Special Forces in the Devil's Brigade in the military and has the title of the Military Medal and Silver Star with a ribbon. Only 3 people have received both medals. Chief Willie Littlechild, who was a Cree lawyer and an international advocate. He was a member of the 1977 UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, as well as a Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner from 2010 to 2015. He's a former member of Parliament, as well as a residential school survivor. The First Nations trailblazers. Throughout First Nations people's history, there have been trailblazers, and there have been accomplished great feats in the arts, social, political, athletics, and the humanities. we have the Honorable Ralph G. Steinhauer, who was the Lieutenant Governor of Alberta, effective from 1974 to 1979, and was a full status member of the Cree tribe. And in 1960, we had Prime Minister John Diefenbaker appointed Senator Gladstone from Alberta as the first Aboriginal senator in Canada, the same year that the First Nations were given the right to vote in Canada. Alexandre of Cold Lake First Nation has also been described as one of the Indian group of 7 who initiated a change in the way that Aboriginal artists were recognized for their talents in Canada, moving from craft to being seen as professional artists. He was elected as a member of the Royal Canadian Academy of the Arts in 1992 and was named a member of the Order of Canada in 2007. He also received the Governor General's Award for Visual and Media Arts. There have been actors of First Nations descent that have done well to represent their culture and contribute to mainstream storytelling in both movies and television, such as Adam Beach of Manitoba, who has portrayed many roles in his career in such films as Wind Talkers and Flags of Our Fathers, also in television series such as Arctic Air and Law and Order. In 1988, Ethel Blondin Andrew Edene of Toledo Northwest Territories was the first Aboriginal woman elected to the House of Commons. She then went on to win the next 4 federal elections in 1993, 97, 2000, and 2004. She was appointed Secretary and then Minister of the State for Training and Youth, making her also the first Aboriginal woman to become a member of the Privy Council and Cabinet. Prior to her political career, Ethel was one of the first accredited Aboriginal teachers in the North, having earned her bachelor's degree in education from the University of Alberta. Previously mentioned, Sergeant Tommy Prince, who was the most decorated First Nation soldier of World War II and the only non-American to be awarded the American Silver Star. So as we have retired Senator Justice Murray Sinclair, who was also a member of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He was the chair. Métis Trailblazers. So who are some of the Métis Trailblazers? Actress Tantoo Cardinal, originally from Fort McMurray, is one of the most recognized actresses of our time. Tantoo is a member of the Order of Canada for her work to support the Aboriginal contributions to the arts. She has been honored with numerous awards, including a Genie nomination, Best Actress for her work in Native American films, and at the Toronto and other international film festivals. She was chosen to be honored as the Actress of the Year by Maclean's magazine. Cree Métis entrepreneur Carrie Langevin of Lac St. Anne is the owner of Mother Earth Essentials, a natural skincare company based in Alberta that created its line based on traditional Aboriginal knowledge. The company garnered the interest of Dragon's Den, and it supplies Sawridge hotels, as well as being sold in over 50 retail and online stores nationwide. She was quoted in an interview as talking about her business in this way: "This is it. This is how we can start breaking down the stereotypes and showcase the beauty of our culture." The Canadian Museum of History was designed by Métis architect Douglas Cardinal, who grew up in Calgary, who is also one of the first architects to use computer-assisted drafting. In 2001, he was given the Governor General's Award in Visual and Media Arts. Asham Curling Supplies is an international name and leader in the curling industry, started by Métis entrepreneur Arnold Asham in Manitoba. In 1978, Arnold Asham introduced the revolutionary red brick slider to the curling community, and today is an international name and leader in the curling industry. Inuit Trailblazers. Inuit people have been setting high standards of accomplishment. Here are some of the Inuit Trailblazers. Zacharias Kunuk is one of the most famous Canadian filmmakers, having won the Gold Award at the Cannes Film Festival for his groundbreaking work in the movie The Fast Runner. Susan Glue-Clark is known around the world for her dedication to her music craft, which combines her Inuit language with storytelling in a way that takes people on unique journeys. Hockey player Jordan Tutu was the first Una to be drafted to the National Hockey League in 2001. Sheila Watt Kluche is an environmental activist who was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 and released a book in 2015 entitled The Right to Be Cold. Of it, she says, we need to be more protective of not just our families and children and what is precious to us, but of course the land, because we are an extension of that land we love so much. Mary Simon, member of the Order of Canada and recipient of the Gold Order of Greenland, has been president of the Inuit Kanatami, the national Inuit political group, and she was president of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. Mary was also the Canadian ambassador to the Kingdom of Denmark, and she is the 30th Governor General of Canada. And we're going to play a video for you that will also give some examples of trailblazers found in Canadian society.
The odds, you're in a trance. Say, who did you think you are to have a chance? You're a no one from a place where everyone knows your face. Come and go away, they know the sun. So you better hang on and hey, you better run. Cause here's your chance and your race is begun. Like two different people in your soul. Feel like a loser until you see that as you bend, you learn to be your own best friend. And you learn how and you learn when to take a chance on the spirit of the wind. We've been so broken, been so low that I kiss the ground. But you can see yourself a winner beyond the money and the greed, beyond the prizes of pure untested need. And to be a champion is more than luck and speed. It's power and freedom in the spirit of the wind.
So Indigenous Peoples Day, it was first suggested by the National Indian Brotherhood, which is now known as the Assembly of First Nations. They had suggested a National Aboriginal Solidarity Day. One of the first recommendations for this day came out of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples Day, as a National First Peoples Day. Elijah Harper decided June 13th, 1996, recommended to Parliament at the time for this National First Peoples Day. And on June 21st, National Aboriginal Day was declared. So how can you support? This year's National Indigenous Peoples Day is on Wednesday, June 21st, 2023. You can do things such as wearing red, white, black, or yellow. Take a photo and share it on social media to bring awareness to National Indigenous Peoples Day. You can download the National Indigenous Peoples Employer Guide. There's great resources for educating yourself as employers. Also read the Truth and Reconciliation Report to implement the calls within your own organization. And call on your member of parliament to implement the National Indigenous Peoples Day as a federal statutory holiday for everyone, and allow your employees the day off to participate in activities and make changes to their schedule, as well as hosting events within your organization. Indigenous Peoples Day celebration. Celebrating Indigenous History Month and National Indigenous Peoples Day have some other strategic considerations. They reinforce for your workforce the employer's commitment to celebrating Indigenous contributions, and it helps position your company as a great place for Indigenous talent. You can do things such as hosting a fundraiser for an Indigenous organization, sponsoring an Indigenous event, or offer your team a paid day off so that they can commemorate the day. Thank you, Miigwech. Now we'll open the floor to questions.
Thank you very much, Mandy. I'm looking at some of the comments and in the chat. And folks, I think you would agree that if you went to university for a semester course in Indigenous history, Mandy did a great job of condensing this into this webinar. And I think that's part of this celebration is we need to know our own history. One of you, Margaret, said this needs to be embedded and taught in our school system. The good news, it is. There is now, in most provinces, curriculum required on Indigenous history and contributions, grade 4, grade 7, grade 11, and so on. At some universities, they're requiring, I think it's Manitoba, University of Manitoba, a mandatory course on Indigenous 101. So down the road, in 20 years from now, your children and your grandchildren are going to say, well, I already know this. I know about Tecumseh. I know about the history and the contributions that Indigenous people have made to Canada. So great job. I think the other thing is when you think about history, what Mandy showcased was we have people who have made a contribution, have passed on, and there are contemporary people that are shaping history today and will continue to shape history. We still have a number of firsts like Keegan, who went on to an international competition in the trades. We have people, record numbers going into university and colleges and breaking glass ceilings. So I think the video underscores the reason to believe is that there are everyday Indigenous Canadians that are making their way, making a contribution to their families, their communities, and of course to the country. Rochelle, you just commented that actually in Ontario, it's grade 4. There's a sort of mandatory curriculum. And so, like I said, I think this underscores the importance of knowledge capital. Without this knowledge, you are left in some cases with misperceptions, stereotypes. And again, you cannot only look at this through the deficit side of the agenda. I like this looking at through the contribution side. Diane says, Nicole, she's saying that I thought Indian was a label that should not be used, but I sometimes heard it referenced several times. Can you help me understand? So here's the lesson on names. First of all, I understand it is confusing. I myself confuse people when I use Indian, Native, Old Inhabitants, First Nations, Métis, Inuit. There are some legal contexts here. If you're entering into contracts, if you're entering into legal documents, you will often the lawyers will say use the constitutional term that was referenced here in 1982, the word Aboriginal, which refers officially to the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. The transition to Indigenous people has been largely in part a political shift, as well as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People got people thinking along this Indigenous line. Also, Indigenous groups did not want to be homogenized. So again, Indigenous was seen, and now you actually see Indigenous being used more and more. When it comes to Indian, again, you need to know that some communities are actually reclaiming that term. Mandy's from the Red Rock Indian Band. Clarence Louie is chief of the Soyuz Indian Band. The oil and gas resource company is Oil and Gas Indian Resource Council. There are many examples I could use that some communities, again, will say, and some people might feel that you should not use Indian, but I would say that you see Indian being reclaimed and used in many different Indigenous organizations, companies, and institutions.
If I can just add a comment on that, Kelly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it goes back to kind of to the literature too that you are referencing, the treaties, you know, the proper names, as Kelly mentioned. I'm from the Red Rock Indian Band, so that's why we have chosen not to take a traditional name, because our treaties referenced Red Rock Indian Band. And then again, when you hear me use the language in the presentation, when I use Aboriginal, because those were the terms that were used by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission at the time in their calls to action. So you know, things do shift and change, but it's one of the things that I've learned in, you know, my educational journey is referring to the context that was used within the literature that you're referring to.
A great point. And here's the tip. And whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, when you go to communities, the question to ask them, what is your preference? How should we refer to you? And, you know, if you're out in Nova Scotia, the Mi'kmaq will say, don't refer to us as First Nations, refer to us as the Mi'kmaq. So you just ask and people will tell you. And as Mandy did, many of them, I think, will explain their rationale, which is a cool explanation. Interesting on language, folks. There was an image in the PowerPoint deck with King George. King Charles was the king who actually signed, King Charles II signed the Hudson Bay Charter, which is the oldest company in Canada, goes back to 1650. And who is the next King Charles? You saw it on TV a few months ago, King Charles III. So it shows you the connection in history to the United Kingdom, our connection to the treaties, our connection to the Dominion of Canada before it was indeed Canada. Oh yeah, go ahead.
One question that came into me from Hannah, is it appropriate for non-Indigenous team members to organize ways to mark National Indigenous Peoples Day for an entire team? How do you involve Indigenous team members without putting the organization on their plate or making them feel obligated to support the work if they would prefer to spend their hours on other projects? This is a great question. We talk about this one a lot.
Mandy, you start.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things too we recommend is, you know, don't make assumptions, because some of your Indigenous employees may choose to honor the day. They may not. You have to think where a lot of Indigenous people within Canada may have that sense of generational trauma that they're not willing to deal with. So, you know, forced participation, you know, can't be mandatory. It has to be, you know, done on their own, but letting them know that they have a respectful environment to participate if they want, and the support of their employer is crucial.
Great. Same response. Give people the option, explain the challenge, the opportunity, how they can create stretch goals and expand their competencies and skills, and then they can choose. And I think it goes back to stereotyping, positive stereotyping, that give people the choice. They will choose. They might want to go into other projects or initiatives. And again, I think this applies not just to Indigenous people. I think this applies to all people in your workforce. Give them the choice on the type of projects and initiatives that they would like to participate in. I saw a reference to our friend Willie Littlechild, and for those of you that are looking for, again, to read a great book, Freddie Sasakamoose was the First Nation to play in the NHL, played with Chicago 8 games. And he's released, there's a book, They Call Me Indian. They Call Me Indian. It's the story of Freddie Sasakamoose, 1958. And just coming, we're all, for those of you that are watching NHL hockey playoffs, rather timely, but I listened to the audiobook. And it's a great story because it again brings out this history that you've just been exposed to today. But the narrator of the audiobook is Willie Littlechild. So it's funny. It'll make you cry. It'll make you laugh. Put it on your reading list and audio list for when you're driving.
Got one more. Do you have any suggestions to engage employees throughout Indigenous History Month? Resources that would be good to share? So I can add a little thing to that. Our Leadership Circle members or employer partners, is there now going to be called with our new website update that we're launching. We'll be getting a tip sheet. And so we've put together that as a team. And then we also have one more webinar that will be happening at the end of June. And so that will be going out before June 1st to everybody for their use. And I welcome anybody else from the team with something to share.
Nicole, you've done a great job on this tip sheet. And again, we are producing these types of trigger sheets and tip sheets, as we call them. And so watch for that resource, and it'll be full of ideas. You can go to the National Film Board, watch some movies through and documentaries through the month of June. There's fantastic examples. So it's not just books and resources like that. I believe that documentaries are a great way to expand. You could make it a challenge. Watch, go to the National Film Board and download and watch a documentary, at least one, through Indigenous History Month. I think the final sort of part that Mandy spoke to was, it's so important in today's labor market to look at employee engagement. How engaged are all your employees? And, some of you actually do conduct studies to look at the engagement drivers. People get these engagement scores, but I think you can just now sort of reflect on companies who are promoting Indigenous history, National Indigenous Day. It will strengthen the engagement of your existing employees, not just Indigenous. I think non-Indigenous people will be proud of the fact that you are positioning and promoting Indigenous History Month and Day. I think it's a positioning and attraction strategy. You will attract. We have an Indigenous labor force that's checking you out. They're checking out websites. And so I think by showcasing what you're doing, it has a dotted line towards, is this a workplace and a company I would like to work for? And finally, use the same in your recruitment strategies. So again, I think there are some dotted lines between these efforts that you're making. It's not just corporate social responsibility. It does have a link to environment, social governance for those that are doing ESG. And finally, if you are doing these activities, put it down as part of your TRC actions. These are clear actions and investments that you're making, and they're important. So we've come to the top of the hour. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. As Nicole said, stay tuned for the June Thought Leader session. Again, we're continuing to expand our knowledge capital. And as she mentioned, next month, you're going to see a new website. Looking forward to unveiling that with resources and tools that you can use. There's going to be, we're creating a members only portal for what we are calling our employer partners. And really, it's an invitation to all of you. Join our community for Indigenous inclusion. This is sort of the branding that we're bringing to. It is a community of practice that's making a difference. We can grow that community of practice by sharing knowledge, implementing that knowledge, and then sharing it back again with the circle. So thanks for joining us today. Thank you very, very much, Mandy, Nicole, Subhash, and the team for executing a great webinar. Enjoy, everybody, and we will see you next month at the Knowledge Capital webinar. Naskelman. Thank you very much.
Gosh, everyone.